The year was 2011. The Arab Spring was sweeping across the Middle East, toppling dictators and igniting hopes for democracy. Syria, under the iron grip of Bashar al-Assad, was no different. Protests, initially peaceful, erupted demanding political reforms and an end to decades of oppression. The Assad regime responded with brutal force, turning the tide of discontent into a raging torrent of rebellion. The crackdown was swift and merciless. Peaceful protesters were met with live ammunition. Arbitrary arrests and torture became commonplace. The regime's heavy-handed response only fueled the flames of resistance. What began as calls for reform quickly morphed into a full-blown armed uprising, marking the start of Syria's descent into a brutal civil war. As the violence escalated, what started as a unified opposition fractured into a myriad of factions, each with its own ideologies, goals, and alliances. The Free Syrian Army, composed largely of defected Syrian army soldiers, emerged as the initial face of the armed rebellion. However, the conflict soon attracted foreign powers, each seeking to advance their interests in the region, further complicating the already chaotic landscape. Out of the chaos and fragmentation of the early rebellion, two distinct groups rose to prominence: the Syrian Democratic Forces and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. These factions, while united in their opposition to Assad, held vastly different visions for Syria's future, further complicating the conflict's trajectory. The SDF, primarily composed of Kurdish fighters, emerged as a force in northern Syria. They gained international recognition for their fierce battle against ISIS, liberating key territories from the clutches of the extremist group. Backed by the United States, the SDF established an autonomous region in northeast Syria, advocating for a decentralized federal system of governance. Meanwhile, on the other side of this fractured battlefield, HTS, with its roots in radical Islamism, consolidated its power in Idlib province. Initially linked to Al-Qaeda, HTS presented itself as a defender of Sunni Muslims against the Assad regime, which it viewed as apostate. Unlike the SDF, HTS sought to establish an Islamic emirate governed by Sharia law. As the Syrian conflict raged on, a new threat emerged that would shake the very foundations of the region and the world: the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This brutal extremist group, notorious for its barbarity and reign of terror, swept across vast swaths of Iraq and Syria, declaring a caliphate and committing horrific atrocities. The rise of ISIS presented a common enemy for the international community and some of the warring factions in Syria. The SDF, recognizing the grave threat posed by ISIS, emerged as a critical partner in the fight against the extremist group. Backed by U.S. air power and military advisors, the SDF spearheaded the ground offensive against ISIS. The SDF, with their courage and determination, liberated key cities from the clutches of ISIS, including Raqqa, the de facto capital of the self-proclaimed caliphate. Their victory against ISIS came at a heavy price, with countless fighters making the ultimate sacrifice in the name of freedom and security. While the SDF battled ISIS in the east, a different kind of conflict was unfolding in the northwestern province of Idlib. This region, a refuge for countless Syrians displaced by the war, became the stronghold of HTS, the dominant rebel faction in the area. HTS, with its roots in radical Islamism and its uncompromising stance against the Assad regime, presented a complex challenge. They provided a degree of stability and governance in Idlib, offering basic services and enforcing their interpretation of Islamic law. However, their hardline ideology and links to extremist groups raised concerns among the international community. Despite calls for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement, HTS remained steadfast in its opposition to the Assad regime. They rejected any peace process that did not include the removal of Assad from power, further complicating efforts to end the Syrian conflict. Section 5. The Shadow of Foreign Powers. The Syrian conflict from its early days became a tangled web of competing interests, with regional and global powers playing out their geopolitical games on Syrian soil. Russia, Iran, the United States and Turkey each intervened, backing different factions and pursuing their agendas, turning Syria into a proxy battleground. Russia, a staunch ally of the Assad regime, entered the conflict in 2015, tipping the balance of power in favor of Assad. Russian air power proved decisive in turning the tide against the rebels, allowing the regime to regain control of key cities and territories. Iran, another key backer of Assad, provided military advisors, financial aid and ground forces, solidifying the regime's grip on power. On the other side of this geopolitical chessboard, the United States provided crucial support to the SDF in their fight against ISIS. However, the U.S. remained wary of deeper involvement in the Syrian quagmire, limiting its support to the fight against ISIS and refraining from directly challenging the Assad regime. Section 6. Human cost of a decade of war. The Syrian conflict over the past decade has unleashed an unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe. The relentless violence, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, and the fragmentation of society have left an indelible scar on the Syrian people. Millions have been displaced, both internally and as refugees seeking safety in neighboring countries and beyond. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates that over 500,000 people have been killed in the conflict, including tens of thousands of civilians. The true toll is likely much higher but remains difficult to document due to the ongoing fighting and the dangers faced by journalists and human rights workers. The conflict has also triggered a severe economic crisis, with the Syrian pound plummeting in value and basic goods becoming scarce and unaffordable for many. The COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated the situation, stretching an already fragile healthcare system to its breaking point. Section 7. Stalemate or brewing storm. Despite the relative lull in large-scale fighting in some parts of Syria, the conflict remains far from over. The underlying tensions, the presence of multiple armed groups, and the unresolved political issues create a volatile environment where violence could erupt again at any moment. In Idlib, HTS remains entrenched, posing a challenge to the Assad regime and its allies. The ceasefire brokered by Russia and Turkey in 2020 remains fragile, with sporadic clashes and airstrikes serving as a constant reminder of the potential for renewed conflict. Meanwhile, the SDF's control of the northeast remains a point of contention. Turkey views the SDF's ties to Kurdish separatists as a threat to its national security and has launched military operations into Syria targeting the group. Section 8. The elusive path to peace. The path to a lasting peace in Syria remains elusive, blocked by a complex web of conflicting interests, deep-seated mistrust, and the absence of a comprehensive political solution. The international community, divided in its approach to the conflict, has failed to broker a peace agreement acceptable to all parties. The Assad regime, emboldened by its military victories, has shown little interest in engaging in meaningful negotiations. They view any opposition as terrorists, and have resisted calls for accountability for war crimes and human rights abuses. The opposition, fragmented and weakened, struggles to present a united front. The various rebel groups, each with their own agendas and external backers, have yet to agree on a unified vision for the future of Syria, further hindering the prospects for a negotiated settlement. Section 9. Conclusion. A future uncertain. As Syria enters its second decade of conflict, the future remains uncertain. The guns may have fallen silent in some areas, but the underlying tensions persist, threatening to reignite the conflict at any moment. The international community, burdened by conflict fatigue and competing priorities, has yet to find a comprehensive solution to the Syrian crisis. Until a political settlement is reached that addresses the root causes of the conflict, the Syrian people will continue to endure the devastating consequences of war. The Syrian conflict serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of failed diplomacy, the devastating impact of proxy wars, and the urgent need for a renewed commitment to peace and reconciliation. The international community must prioritize a Syrian-led political solution, ensuring accountability for crimes committed and providing humanitarian aid to those in desperate need.